familiar faces in the room. I'm delighted that we can have the session here, although I regret it's still virtual. Nonetheless, for the Las Alamas meeting 2021, we're here in a session on inequality, causes, and macro consequences. I will chair the session. My name is Christian Moser. I'm from Columbia University and the Federal Reserve of Minneapolis. And we're going to have 4 fantastic papers. Without further ado, we'll start with Mauricio Calani, who's going to present on the portfolio choice channel of wealth inequality. And to stay roughly on time, Mauricio and everyone else will have 20 minutes for each paper, essentially including discussion. So if you can aim to have roughly 15 minutes of your presentation, and then ideally 5 minutes of sort of open floor with only clarifying questions in between. Thanks, and the floor is yours, Mauricio.
Great. Let me share my screen. Hopefully it's still working. Right. Thank you to the organizers for having our paper here. This is a joint paper with Lucas Rosso from the Universidad de Chile. The title of the paper is Portfolio Choice Channel of Wealth Inequality. So usual disclaimer applies. I'm at the Central Bank of Chile, so these are my opinions, not the board's opinions. So what is the motivation for our paper? So we want to understand what is the role of households' portfolio choice in wealth inequality. So usually you would divide this in 2. You would have that you either across the wealth distribution, you either save more if you're richer, or you make more money on returns on each dollar saved. So there's more evidence on the first channel being less important, that net savings are relatively flat across the wealth distribution. So we really want to dig in the second part, so that rich people make more money on each dollar not consumed. This points to a scale-dependent component of wealth accumulation, and the evidence is growing fast, and the results are pointing to that this holds even within narrow asset classes. So what does the theory tell us? So portfolio choice and scale, this scale dependence are usually absent in the workhorse models of wealth accumulation. This does not mean that these models are wrong. There are, of course, the benchmark, and we try to also compare ourselves to those. But for these models, we know that it is hard to get a large top wealth shares, and we try to go in that direction. And we also try to put in our model realistic participation rates and risky shares that we observe in the data. So we propose a model that explicitly incorporates households' portfolio decisions. What do we gain by doing that? First, our model is able to narrow the gap between the workhorse model and the data in around half. So we think that's huge. It's not perfect, but we think that's important. And second, we propose in this model the existence of this or the importance of this portfolio adjustment friction in a risky asset. And we push the idea that this interacts with precautionary motives. And so it can actually amplify changes in household saving behavior due to another shock, for example, and affecting the wealth distribution. So the intuition of our model in a nutshell is that we have the same Ayagari type Hewlett-Haggett-Building models, and with 2 assets, a safe asset and a risky asset. The risky asset has this non-convex adjustment cost. So for poor households, this cost will be more important relatively to their wealth. So this will generate inaction on their side. So these people will not participate in the risky asset market. This generates portfolio heterogeneity, and that buys you return heterogeneity on your complete portfolio of savings. On the other hand, you have rich households, they hold riskier portfolios. This cost is relatively less important, and also fluctuations in income risk is also less important. So these guys are also, they also have some inaction, and this talks to the literature that speaks about savings by holding. So some stylized facts, we have a lot in the paper, but I'm just going to show you 2 figures. So here we have what we know from the literature. This is the survey for consumer finances, and you have the wealth distribution and the risky share across the wealth distribution. So poor people have 0% of their wealth in risky assets. and rich people have around 60%. What we dig more in, we exploit more in our paper is the second one, but we speak to the first one too. It's about the extensive margin. So what this figure tells us that people at the left-hand side of the wealth distribution, these guys don't participate. That means they don't have risky assets. But when you go to the top of to the very right, you see that these people, everyone has risky assets. So there's this extensive margin and this intensive margin components. I'm just going to skip this literature, but what we basically do is we try to combine the portfolio choice models, Merton Samuelson, with these Bewley, Haggett, Ayagari models, and try to see what comes out of it. So what is our model? Our model is a continuous time partial equilibrium hacked model. So as I mentioned, we have a household's balance sheet that we try to make it as rich as possible. They have safe and risky assets. We have hard and soft borrowing constraints. Hard borrowing constraints, it's the usual, you can't borrow beyond certain limit, and soft borrowing constraints for the safe asset, the lending rate from the lending rate is going to be higher than the saving rate. We introduce this fixed adjustment cost. It's going to be very key in our in this paper. It's going to be very small, but it can go a long way. We also have uninsurable labor income risk. And notably, we don't have aggregate uncertainty. So this is going to be just idiosyncratic uncertainty. So these guys have uninsurable income risk. They have just low income and high income. The safe asset will be this B. The risky will be this A. There will be a stop-in-time component in this model because you have to pay every time you want to rebalance your portfolio. You have to choose exactly when you want to do that. So there's going to be a choose variable. The risky asset follows this law of motion, with the W being the Brownian motion. Returns is stochastic for these guys. One simplifying assumption is that labor income, which is stochastic, and this is stochastic return risky asset are independent from each other. We're working on extensions, but to a first pass, we didn't think this was too important. So this is the basic problem that we solve. So we have this value function that is a function of risky and safe assets and income of the household. This guy has to choose a stream of, and it has to choose this stopping time. So when it's not adjusting, he wants to maximize the flow of utility from consumption, and it has to choose when exactly to rebalance. When this guy rebalances, note that this thing does not have 3 arguments, but it has 2 arguments, because then we go to this equation in the bottom, that given that the guy pays this fixed cost, and out of his wealth, he can choose whatever combination of A and B, risky and safe assets, he can have. And so this basically is these are basically all the restrictions, the law of motions of risky and safe assets, conditional on not adjusting, because when they adjust, then we trigger the stopping time element. We have the stochasticity from the wealth distribution, from the income fluctuations, and the usual usual non-negative constraints and the borrowing constraint, the hard borrowing constraint. So you all know this. You can express this into a Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman condition. I guess the most important part in this problem, particular to this problem, is that due to the adjustment costs, households don't rebalance at every point. So this inequality will be a strict inequality. But when the sum of the value of adjusting plus the cost of adjusting is equal to this to the value on the left-hand side of this equation, these guys reoptimize. So in a sense, how you solve this model is that when B and B star are equal, that triggers the rebalancing. You can express this, this is perhaps too much detail. You can express this into a Hamilton Jacobi-Bellman quasi-variational inequality, but you basically just put this last equation I talked about in this intervention operator. The only thing that you need from this setup is to to be very careful about getting this A matrix right. This A matrix will pick up all the elements in this Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equation, because you want to keep that for to calculate the stationary distribution using this Kolmogorov forward equation. So this is pretty standard and follows closely all the hints for match do and co-authors. So let me go to what the model can bring. So just let me know how much time when I'm running out of time, please. The parameterization is very standard. The borrowing constraint is -1 annual income. This soft borrowing constraint I was telling you about is captured by this interest rate wedge, which is parameterized at 6%. That's the difference between the lending and the saving rate. The safe return is equal to 2%, and the risky is 6% with a volatility of around 0.18. I'm going to tell you more about this kappa parameter in the next slide. So I'm just going to save that. And we have this income process for labor income. So how do we calibrate kappa? This is the one parameter that we calibrate internally. So we do this to match how many people, how the percentage of people in the extensive market participating in having some risky asset. That's around 51% for the survey consumer finances. That yields a kappa of 0.23, and that's a very small number. It's around 0.75%. That's 0.0075 of your wealth every time you want to adjust. So it's around the numbers that Wissing-Jorgensen sort of in the ballpark of Wissing-Jorgensen's estimation. But this buys a lot of inaction. So 70% of the time, for 70% of the points in the grid, you have inaction, both at the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the distribution of both assets. Okay, so what do we gain from all this? What does this buy? So on this column here, the data, we have the data from the survey consumer finances. On the very right, we have what we call fat tail Ayagari, which is basically taking our model, shutting off kappa equal to 0, which basically boils down to combining Ayagari and Merton. This model, this benchmark model, will tell you that the top 1% holds 11% of the wealth distribution. So just by adding this kappa that is very, very, very low in relative terms to the wealth, this generates a lot of inaction and can bring you to around half of the difference between 37 and 11, and that holds for other moments of the wealth distribution. We still acknowledge there's much room to go from baseline model to data, but this is the simplest one we can come up with, and we're working on some extensions to bring this gap a little closer to data. We also point in our paper about we also want to stress the fact that this kappa, this cost interacts with precautionary motives, and the precautionary motives bite more when you are closer to the constraints. So we present, for example, this exercise. Suppose that you have wealth, you have labor risk going down from in around 10%, from 0.20 to 0.18. So what this means is that poor people save less because the risk is lower. So in a way, they stop saving, and some stop participating in the risky asset. This generates that there are less excess returns for these people, then less wealth, and because of the scale effect, this goes on and on and on. So if you do this exercise in the fat Ayagari, of course, precautionary motives can give you the right direction. So the top 1%, the top shares, they are larger with less risk. But if you add this kappa, this adjustment cost in the risky asset, you can go way, you can go a long way above that. So this actually, when I push the idea that this adjustment cost, though very small, can interact in a very nonlinear way with the precautionary motives sketched in the model. So lastly, this is a very, very preliminary result. But what we want to say about with this exercise is that we want to decompose how much of the top shares is due to luck and scale. So what we call luck is ex post people with a lot of risky assets or have a lot of good positive shocks, and so their wealth grew. And this scale effect that because of this adjustment cost, these people had more risky assets to begin with. So the way we do that is that we basically leverage our last exercise, but instead of keeping our kappa constant, we recalibrate the model and to keep the extensive margin constant. So the number of people, the share of people that actually participate in the risky asset market is constant. And with that, we can separate the scale from luck. So keeping the scale constant, whatever is left, we call luck, basically the realization of the stochastic events. So our results from that is that basically luck just kind of can account for roughly 12%, and scale does most of the job. We're working on a lot of robustness and twisting the model and again, but we're still very happy of our result. That this very small change in the workhorse model can help us account for a large share in the top wealth of distribution. Also, I didn't show you the picture, but the risky share that I showed you, the figure 1, the model can also account for that. So we calibrate the model with the extensive margin, but the model does a right job in the intensive margin. We push the idea that the adjustment frictions can amplify portfolio choice and interact with the precautionary motives. And finally, portfolio choice and adjustment frictions can go a long way into narrowing the gap in top share of the wealth distribution. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mauricio. Just on time. Very impressive. And I'm going to have the floor open for the next 4 minutes or so for any questions from the audience. I would have a small, just technical question, Mauricio. I'm wondering, does the standard quote unquote toolbox by Ben Moll and others just apply here? Or could you maybe highlight briefly once more, it was maybe a little bit too fast, some of the technical aspects of solving this model?
Sure. Yeah, so Ben Moll has been very generous in putting all his material online. So we build on a lot of what he's doing. So we solved this model with finite differences. I guess the only tricky part here is to account for the stationary distribution. So usually in this type of models without this intervention operator, the matrix A you have already, then you have just to use the adjoint and you're there. The only trick beyond that is that now you have inaction, but then you have this rebalancing. So you have to take care of that rebalancing. So you have to take mass away from when this guy is rebalancing his portfolio and putting it where it belongs in the optimal in the optimal combination. So you sort of have to do like that by hand. But the finite differences approach really discretizes the thing, and it's sort of like really easy numerically, although math may seem like ugly. Numerically, it's very straightforward. It resembles a little bit about the way we used to solve heterogeneous agent models in discrete time with the Kruszell-Smith sort of technique. You just move mass from one place to another using the policy functions. But aside from that, Ben Moll's toolkit is you can just use it here. It's basically yeah. Didn't think anyone was going to ask that one.
Anyone with a question, I should have said, feel free to unmute yourselves. If you're shy, you can also raise your hand and then I'll call you.
Well, if not, please feel free to reach us, Lucas and I, and we'll be very happy to discuss. We're at the very beginning of this project, so any feedback we would really appreciate.
Thanks again, Mauricio. It was an exceptionally clear presentation, so I'm not entirely surprised. All right, so with that, let's move onwards to our second presentation. Andres, floor is yours. You're going to talk about the natural resource boom and factor shares. And again, you're going to have 20 minutes, hopefully including some discussion of around 5 minutes in the end.
Okay, Christian, thank you very much. I'm thrilled to present my joint work with Manuel Fernandez and Hernando Zuleta about the natural resource boom and the uneven fall of the labor share. So let me begin motivating the paper. Here in this figure, we present the weighted average of factor income shares accruing to total labor and natural resources. And I want to draw the attention to two stylized facts. First, we see that between 2000 and 2010, there is a global decline of the labor share in around 4.7%. And second, during this same period, there is a rise in the natural resource share in around 11.8%. And this rise in the natural resources income share is fueled by the commodity price boom of the 2000s. So the question that motivates this paper is if these two trends are related. These patterns that we observe in factor income shares data are related. Moreover, here we explore the complete functional distribution of income. In this figure, we plot the changes in the population weighted average of factor shares accruing to human capital, raw labor, physical capital, and natural resources, which is the complete functional distribution of income once we separate by reproducible and non-reproducible factors. And again, I want to highlight two stylized facts. First, we see that during this period, the changes in both the human capital and the raw labor shares are relatively similar. They fall in similar magnitudes. But in the capital side of the functional distribution of income, the natural resource share grew more than the physical capital share. And this is a fact that has been overlooked by the literature. So the question that we want to explore in this paper is if this rise in the natural resources income share shaped the patterns that we observe in the distribution of income across the other factors. Then our research question is, what is the effect of a natural resource boom on the functional distribution of income? In particular, we want to answer what is the effect of a sharp price-induced increase in the natural resource income on both aggregate and relative factor income shares. And once we answer this with our estimated parameters, we wish to quantify the rate in which the commodity price boom of the 2000s explains the global decline of the labor share. And that's our purpose in this paper. So to answer these research questions, what we do in the paper goes as follows. First, we build a Dutch disease model that allows us to derive a set of equations that characterize how natural resources windfalls affect equilibrium factor shares. We then measure income shares accruing to raw labor, human capital, physical capital, and natural resources. Using both the theoretical predictions and our data on factor shares, we estimate the response of aggregate and relative factor shares to changes in commodity prices. And to do so, our empirical strategy relies in two-way fixed effects and a shift share instrument. With our estimated parameters, we then quantify the effect of the commodity price boom of the 2000s on the functional distribution of income. And we, in specific, we will explore effects on both labor and physical capital income shares, and we will document a redistribution effect within the labor share of income between raw labor and human capital. Okay. Now, our contribution to literature is threefold. First, we contribute to a literature on Dutch disease through our theoretical model, analyzing the effects on sectoral composition of output of a natural resource boom. Second, we contribute to a wide literature on the fall of the labor share, presenting a new explanation in commodity price booms to understand the global decline of the labor share during the 2000s. And finally, we contribute to a family of the literature of a mechanism much less understood of Dutch disease and natural resource boom booms, which is the relationship between a natural resource boom and inequality. And in this branch of the literature, we will focus in the effects of a natural resource boom in the functional distribution of income, in how income is distributed across factors of production. Okay, so let me first explain how we build our data set on factor income shares. We first measure country and year level estimates of the total labor share, which is basically the ratio between employee compensation and GDP, net of indirect taxes and gross mixed income to account for the income of the self-employed. We then separate the total labor share between human capital and raw labor using microdata and estimating means and regressions to recover the raw labor share of wages following Kruger. And in the case we do not count with sufficient microdata, we employ an imputation methodology, which is basically locating the raw wage of workers in the wage distribution of workers with low education and no experience. And in the cases where we don't have microdata at all for a country and year pair to which we have the total labor share, we use a gradient boosting machines algorithm to predict the raw labor share of wages. Finally, we separate the total capital share into physical capital and natural resources income shares using measures of wealth and stocks of natural resources and physical capital following the methodology of Caselli and Freire. Okay, once we build this data set, we can begin to explore the answer to our research question. And in this figure, we make precisely that. So here I present the correlation between the natural resource share, which is our measure of the natural resource boom, and factor income shares accruing to physical capital, total labor, human capital, and raw labor. And I want to draw the attention to two results. First, in general, we see a negative correlation between the natural resource share and factor income shares. And second, this correlation is not homogeneous across factors of production. We see that the slope of the negative correlation is heterogeneous, for instance, between total labor and physical capital. The slope of the correlation with total labor is much higher than the slope of the correlation with physical capital. So keeping this negative but heterogeneous correlation between factor income shares and the natural resource share, let me present the model that guides our empirical application. So first, we will have a production site with non-tradable, tradable, and natural resources sectors. The tradable and non-tradable sectors produce consumption goods using physical capital, raw labor, and human capital. And the natural resource sector produces a commodity using these same three factors and a natural resource endowment, which is exogenous and fixed. Here we allow for perfect factor mobility across sectors, and we do not impose any kind of assumptions on the market structure of production. And in this setting, we can calculate two kinds of factor income shares. First, sector-specific factor income shares, which will be the factor share for a factor F in the sector S is simply the ratio between total expenditure on that factor within the sector relative to total output on the sector. And the shares of income in the complete economy, which is simply the factor share equals the total expenditure in the factor relative to GDP. In the consumption side of the model, we have agents with identical preferences that derive utility from consuming tradable and non-tradable goods, where this parameter gamma represents the relative preference for non-tradable goods. Our households will supply labor, a unit of raw labor, inelastically, and will own human capital, and the natural resource endowment. And regarding the natural resource endowment, we assume that each agent receives a share of the rents from natural resources. But this assumption does not change any kind of theoretical predictions from the model. We can assume that each household is the owner of natural resources, or that they receive rents as a transfer from the government. Regardless of our assumption on ownership of natural resources, the theoretical predictions hold. Now, the household then has income from a fixed endowment of factors and face a usual budget constraint. Now, a general equilibrium in this model, once we define both the production side and the demand side, is given by conditions where all agents are optimizing and markets clear. Here, to achieve a general equilibrium, we have to impose two conditions. First, a market clearing condition in the non-tradable sector. And second, we must assume that the price of natural resources is the price of the commodity prices are exogenous and determined in international markets, which is that there is no local consumption of natural resources in the domestic economy. Okay, now our model in equilibrium, we are able to write, with our model in equilibrium, we're able to write factor income shares, equilibrium factor income shares, and we find that each factor share can be decomposed in two terms. First, a weighted average of the non-tradable and tradable within sector-specific factor shares. And the second term, which is the one of greatest interest to us, is the effect of a natural resource boom that we measure by changes in commodity prices on factor shares. And here we see that rising commodity prices will lead to a fall in factor shares if the factor in question has a sector-specific factor share higher in the tradable sector than in the natural resource sector. So the effect of the natural resource boom on factor shares depends on the relative intensity in which factors are used, both in the tradable sector and in the natural resources sector. Besides these aggregate factor shares, we write the relative factor shares, which are simply the difference between a factor f and f prime of this equation, and the interpretation is exactly the same. And we will explore for relative factor shares the within labor factor share, which is the difference between the human capital and raw labor factor share, and the between labor and capital relative share, which is the difference between the total labor share and the physical capital share. Okay, now to test the empirical relevance of these theoretical predictions, we use regressions both for aggregate factor shares and relative factor shares with country fixed effects, year and group specific flexible time trends, which we will use for both region and income level groups, and a vector of controls that I will explain in the next slide. And we measure the natural resource boom using the natural resources factor income share, which we use as a proxy for the share of output of the natural resource sector. And we estimate beta, which is our parameter of interest, and gives us the impact of the natural resource boom on individual factor shares for total labor, human capital, raw labor, and physical capital, and the relative factor shares of human capital to raw labor and total labor to physical capital. Here in these regressions, our identification challenge is to isolate variation in the natural resource share induced by exogenous changes in commodity prices. If we manage to do this, beta is the impact of the natural resource boom on factor shares. So to achieve this, we construct a standard shift share instrument for the natural resource share, combining a China shock measured by the upsurge in the price paid by China for commodities, and the exposure of each country to this shock that we measure using the commodities export share in our baseline year, in 1995, weighted by trade openings. We find a strong first stage of this instrument, and our identification strategy, besides the instrument, relies in our fixed effect sets. And due to the importance of China in the world manufacturing sector, we have a threat of China's trade of manufacturing products with the world for our exclusion restriction of the shift share instrument. So we control for baseline manufacturing value added and the weight of China exports on each country's imports. Okay, now let me briefly present our results, our estimates. I will focus in the interest of time, because I think I'm already running out of time. I will focus in the last column of our tables, which is our preferred specification, where we estimate the effect using our IV strategy and fixed effects using income group specific time trends. So our first result is that a rise in the natural resource share, which is driven by the commodity price boom, has an impact of around 4 percentage points, rising 1 standard deviation of the natural resource share, a negative and significant impact of 4 percentage points on the total labor share. So we first find that the natural resource boom explains the decline of the total labor share. It's a negative and significant effect over the total labor share. Now, if we explore factor shares within total labor, we first find a negative and significant effect of the commodity price boom on the human capital share in around 5 percentage points for an increase in 1 standard deviation of the natural resource share. But we do not find a negative and significant effect on the raw labor share. Besides, we find a non-significant effect that, if anything, is positive of a rise in 1 standard deviation of the natural resource share over the raw labor share. Therefore, when we estimate the impact of the commodity price boom on the human capital to raw labor relative share, we find a negative and significant effect that suggests that in the global decline caused by the commodity price boom, in the global decline of the labor share caused by the commodity price boom, there is a redistribution effect against human capital and in favor of raw labor. And that is what we call the uneven fall of the labor share. While human capital is losing ground thanks to the natural resource boom, raw labor remains unchanged. Okay. We also estimate the impact of the natural resource share over the physical capital share and find a negative and significant effect of around 6 percentage points for one increase in 1 standard deviation. But when we estimate the effect over the relative share between total labor and physical capital, we do not find a significant impact of the natural resource boom. So that are the results of our paper. With the estimated parameters, we perform a counterfactual exercise and compute the predicted change of factor income shares between 2000 and 2010 if the natural resource share was fixed at the level of the 2000. And we compare this counterfactor change with the observed change of factor shares. I will briefly state our 3 conclusions from this counterfactual exercise. First, we calculate that the natural resource boom explains around 25-24% of the global decline of the total labor share. Second, the natural resource boom equalized the falls of the human capital and raw labor shares, while in the absence of the natural resource boom, the human capital share would have fall much less than the raw labor share. And finally, the physical capital share would have grew much more in the absence of the natural resource boom, such that the commodity price boom of the 2000s caused an attenuation effect in the trend of the physical capital share. Okay, so that's our paper. Please give me a minute to conclude. In this paper, we show the commodity price boom impact on factor share depends on the relative intensity of factors in the trade and natural resources sector. We find that a commodity price boom causes a change in the functional distribution of income through a negative effect on total labor, human capital, and physical capital. Here, we find that the raw labor share remains unchanged. But in that sense, we are able to find a redistribution effect in favor of labor and against human capital. That is what we call an uneven fall of the labor share. Moreover, we quantify that the natural resource boom explains around 24% of the global decline of the total labor share. And thanks to our results of the redistribution effect of the commodity price boom, we conclude that the natural resource boom of the 2000s hindered the pace of growth of inequality, given the fact that raw labor is a factor much more homogeneously distributed across the population. That's our paper. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry that I used much more time than I was supposed to. Sorry.
Thank you, Andres. Excellent. Super interesting work. We have a minute left, so if anyone has any questions, this would be a good time.
Hi, Andres. I have a question. Very nice work. It's very interesting. And actually, I have just for curiosity, you have that this commodity price boom generates a fall in the capital share, and that's puzzling, no? Because you would think that natural resource, like for example, for Chile, copper is super capital intensive. So what do you think about that result? Do you have any clue about it?
Yes. Okay. So maybe the best way to answer your really interesting question, and we are actually working in a way to tell this story in which is consistent with the intensity of the production of natural resources, mainly in Latin America, which is one of the countries that are most exposed to the commodity price boom are mainly Latin America. But the parameter that we estimate is this difference, the difference between the factor income share within the natural resource sector and the tradable sector. So, for example, the production of natural resources can be really intensive in capital, but what our estimates suggest is that is more intensive in the tradable sector. The tradable sector is more intensive in the use of capital than the natural resource sector. So you can have an economy like Chile that is intensive in the use of capital in the natural resource sector, but our estimates suggest that it's a little bit more intensive in the tradable sector, but not a little bit, in around 6 percentage points more intensive in the tradable sector.
Excellent. Thanks very much, guys. I want to move on just to make sure we stay on time. If we're lucky, we're going to have a couple of minutes in the end where we should have more discussion, hopefully. Mario, you're going to be next. We're going to hear from Mario Jarda, and he's going to present on the labor earnings gap, heterogeneous wage Phillips curves, and monetary policy. Mario, like before, you have 20 minutes, including hopefully 5 minutes for discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Christian. I'm gonna take like 15 minutes. Actually, I prepared like 10 slides, so I'm gonna be very short. So this work is, okay, I'm Mario Yarda. I'm a senior economist at the Central Bank of Chile, and this is part of my dissertation of my PhD. Okay, so what's the motivation of this paper? Well, how household heterogeneity affects aggregate demand. Okay, these questions have been around like for the last 10 years, I think, and now it's becoming. We have been having like a lot of results to discuss and to have. The main result of this literature is that when households are subject to financial constraint, there are indirect effects of, in particular, monetary policy shocks, and that's shown by Kaplan-Violante, Oclert, and among others. This is a wide literature that is growing, and they show this by assuming there are uninsurable income risk plus some borrowing constraints, like the paper presented by Mauricio. But I think that permanent differences in this literature has not been studied much in the context of business cycles. Okay, so what I do in this paper is to separate the economy into two types of workers and study, in particular, skilled and unskilled workers, and study if there are some heterogeneities among them that generates aggregate effects, in particular through the aggregate demand. I think this can be a nice representation of the economy or of heterogeneity because you have an observable feature and you can follow these guys like on time, and that's something you cannot. We can discuss this, but with percentiles or desires, you cannot do it. So you cannot target those guys super well, I think. So I think okay, this paper, I'm gonna present you a set of empirical facts. Where first I build an index of inequality that I call the earnings gap, yeah, which is the share of the ratio of labor income of the skilled to unskilled workers, and I'm going to show you that this is countercyclical. Inequality raises in recessions and falls in booms. It is also countercyclical. Conditional on a monetary policy shock. This is monetary policy when there's a contractionary monetary policy, this earnings gap increases in response to a monetary policy shock. And then I'm going to try to convince you that just having this earnings gap cyclicality is important because skilled workers are gonna have more access to financial markets than unskilled workers. So unskilled workers are gonna have higher marginal propensities to consume. So the combination between having a highly volatile labor income plus high marginal propensities to consume is gonna generate a lot of amplification from monetary policy shocks. And finally, I'm going to show you a reason why I think the earnings gap is countercyclical, which is that unskilled workers face much more rigid wages than skilled workers. Okay, I estimate wage Phillips curve for these two types of workers, and I show that the slope of the Phillips curve of unskilled workers is much flatter. Okay, and the intuition of all these results together is the following: if there's a recession or there's a contractionary monetary policy shock that generates a recession that requires all wages to go down, if wages of the unskilled are more rigid than wages of the skilled, this first group of workers become more expensive relative to skilled workers. And if there's some kind of gross substitution between them in production, you're going to see that there's going to be a switch in demand from unskilled to skilled workers that's going to depress labor income of the unskilled workers much more than the skilled. And that generates the increase in the earnings gap. And that plus this heterogeneity in MPCs is going to generate the amplification of monetary policy shocks. Wait me a second, I have to plug in my computer. So then, so the research question of this paper is very simple: is what is the contribution of this heterogeneity in wage rigidities to the transmission of monetary policy? I'm going to propose you then a model with two types of workers within a two-agent New Keynesian model. This is much more simple than what Mauricio presented. We can discuss why I do this, where I assume there are two types of workers: a skilled and unskilled worker, that have different share of constrained workers within the consumer, within the group, which means that I'm going to generate or assume that one type of worker, in particular the unskilled worker, has higher MPCs, marginal propensities to consume. So their consumption is going to be more related to their income at every period, and the slope of the wage Phillips curve are going to be different, where unskilled wages are going to be more sticky. Okay, and okay, I hope this it is clear what the main message of this paper is, that we should look as central bankers. We should see what happens with inequality when we make our policies. No. Let me skip the related literature. So I'm gonna, what is the roadmap of this presentation? I will present you some these empirical facts very briefly, the model in 2 slides, and if there's time permits, a quantitative exercise. Okay, so let me start by the empirical facts. What I do here, I'm going to show you that this earnings gap is countercyclical. What's the earnings gap for me? Is the ratio of skilled to unskilled labor income, but just taking the average of a skilled and unskilled labor income. So this is going to be like a per capita measure of inequality between these two types of workers. To measure this, I take the current population survey from 1979 to 2018, where I divide workers between unskilled and skilled, where unskilled are workers with up to some college, and skilled higher completed college or higher. Okay, and this is how the labor earnings gap look. Okay, there's a trend there. Let's for now don't focus on the trend. It's interesting by itself, but what the main message of these figures has is that there's a positive relationship between unemployment and the earnings gap. This is, in recession, the inequality goes up by a lot and is positively related with unemployment. Okay, so if you take the cyclical component of both the earnings gap and unemployment, you're going to find a positive relationship. Okay, so unconditionally, the earnings gap is countercyclical. But now let's take an identified shock and see if this happens conditional on a shock. For example, a monetary policy shock. So what I do in the right-hand side is I take an instrumental variable VAR by Miranda, Gripino, and Rico at the AJ macro, where they kind of update Gertler-Carali shocks, and they propose like an informationally cleaned monetary high frequency monetary policy shock. Okay. And this is how the responses of the variables in this model look. And the earnings gap increases substantially and persistently after a 1% monetary policy shock, but also at the same time, naturally, industrial production is falling. So the point here is that the earnings gap is also countercyclical, conditional on this shock. Okay, so this is the first message. The second message is, what are the heterogeneities that are going to matter? There are a lot, but I'm going to focus on two. The first one is that unskilled workers are more financially constrained. And the second one is that they have a flatter wage Phillips curve. Okay, so how I measure financially constrained? Here I do it very, very simple. I take the approach by Kaplan, Violante, and Weiner, where they measure the share of hand to mouth as the share of households that hold zero liquid assets. Okay, and this means that these guys are going to have very little space to smooth out consumption if they receive a shock. That's their point. So I'm going to take in a sense, a shortcut and say, okay, I'm going to assume, and then I say, okay, I'm going to measure the share of hand to mouth for the different types of workers, where I find that unskilled workers have a higher share of hand to mouth workers. Okay, so if you take this and combine this with the fact that their earnings are fluctuating much more in the cycle, you're going to have amplification of shocks through consumption. But the other part, the other heterogeneity, is the one that explains why the earnings gap is countercyclical. And this is my hypothesis is that the wages of the skilled have a different rigidity than wages of the unskilled. And if you just plot the data, okay, and you can look at this by studying wage Phillips curves. Okay, why? Because if studying the slope this wage Phillips curve, if wage inflation of some group responds much more to movements in unemployment, I'm gonna say that this group has a more flexible wage. Okay, this is what I plot here. I plot the relationship between wage inflation and the unemployment rate. And what you can see is that skilled workers have a much a steeper wage Phillips curve than unskilled workers. Okay, but we know that this literature is very large, and it's a very wide literature about estimating wage and price Phillips curve. And the main conclusion is that taking the OLS of these two, between these two variables, has a lot of problems, in particular because you are omitting a lot of variables, in particular, for example, the natural unemployment rate that also moves over time, but we don't have an idea of what it is. So what I do is to take an approach proposed by Galli and Gambetti, where they estimate this slope through a dynamic multiplier by using an exogenous shock like a monetary policy shock. So what I do is to take the instrumental variable VAR I just used before, augment it by wage inflation and unemployment, and then studied the ratio of the responses of wage inflation and unemployment to this monetary policy shock. And what I find is something very similar to what I have here, is that the dynamic multipliers, which is a proxy of the wage Phillips curve, are very different, and the dynamic multiplier of the skilled workers is much larger than the one of the unskilled. This suggests that skilled workers face more flexible wages, okay? So in the end, now I'm gonna propose you a model that's gonna try to fit all these things together. And to do this, let me take just 2 minutes, or maybe I have, how much, 3 minutes, Christian? Or 3, 4? Okay, so the model is a new Keynesian model with skilled and unskilled workers, where there's a share of unskilled denoted by mu, and within each group, there's a share of hand-to-mouth workers denoted by lambda h. And production, and this is the first heterogeneity. The second key assumption is that production demands both workers with an elasticity of substitution that is going to be given by sigma, which is different from 1, because we need the earnings gap and the ratio of labor income to fluctuate. And we know that this is not going to happen if we have a Cobb-Douglas. We need, and also the last key heterogeneity, I assuming, is that wage rigidities are heterogeneous. So I'm going to assume that, in particular, unskilled workers are going to face a flatter Phillips curve, so they're going to have a higher cost of wage adjustment. This assumption, we know, delivers a new Keynesian wage Phillips curve, and within this new Keynesian wage Phillips curve, we know that, as in any new Keynesian model, there's going to be a markup that is going to fluctuate, a wage markup, and it's going to be countercyclical. And the more rigid the wage, the more fluctuating this markup is, and this is going to be a very important part of the result I'm going to just show you in the next slide. Okay, so let me give you a bit of an intuition. If you assume that the skilled workers are fully unconstrained, so their consumption follows an Euler equation, and the unskilled workers is fully constrained, so they just consume their labor income. And in the economy, the labor is the only income. You can show that output depends not only on the expected path of future interest rates, but also on an inequality wedge that is going to depend on the earnings gap denoted by eta. Okay, so let me give you the intuition of this result is that whenever the earnings gap, this index of inequality, increases, when GDP goes down, there's going to be amplification. Why this happens? Because income of the high MPC agent in this recession, the unskilled, is falling by more than income of the low MPC, the skilled worker. Okay, so this is the first thing. And the second thing is that if you solve for the earnings gap and the earnings gap cyclicality in this very simple framework, what you're gonna get is that to generate a countercyclical earnings gap, you require two things. You can show that this cyclicality depends on a parameter and the relationship between the two markups. Okay, and this parameter, this depends explicitly on the elasticity of substitution between workers, and if the elasticity of substitution is higher than 1, this is going to be negative, and for equation 3 to be negative as well, you need that the green this green term, which is the relationship between the markups, to be positive, and this happens when the wages of the unskilled are more rigid, so this falls by more than wages of the skilled. Okay, and just one line more and I finish, Christian. And maybe what's the intuition of this? This is the main result of the paper, is that when there's a recession or there's a contractionary monetary policy shock that requires all wages to go down, if wages of the unskilled are stickier, unskilled workers are going to become more expensive than skilled workers. And with high substitution between these two workers, you're going to have a switch in demand from unskilled to skilled that's going to increase the earnings gap. And this is how all these things fit together. Okay, so let me skip the quantitative exercise. I just calibrate the model in order to get reasonable a response with the an answer with the proper
we should wrap up in a moment.
Yes, and yes, and that's all. So what I do, I show that there's a inequality is countercyclical inequality between skilled and unskilled workers is countercyclical. It raises in response to a contractionary monetary policy shock. And the reason why this happens is because there are heterogeneity in wage rigidities. This is important because it's going to generate amplification effects of monetary policy shocks through aggregate demand. And sorry if I took 1 or 2 minutes more. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Let's thank Mario for his presentation. I still want to give you like a minute or so, just in case there are any questions from the audience. And then, as I said, maybe later we'll have more time.
Okay.
Any pressing questions right now?
I have a quick question. So I was trying to wrap my mind around why it is that they have different wage rigidity. So what's the intuition? What should I take home about the intuition on that one? And second, so in this sort of model, you say that differentiated unemployment insurance or contingent and wage. I'm not sure you showed us, but wages are they lower for unskilled workers? So in that, so can differentiated unemployment insurance be cheaper and have a lot of traction, have more traction than a universal one?
Mario, you can answer in like 30 seconds, and then I would like to reserve maybe some time in the end for like more deep questions, big picture questions like this.
Okay, the second question, yes, I think that's one point. And the first question, I think that, for example, unskilled workers are closer to the minimum wage, for example, that can be an answer. So they have more sticky wages from like the left-hand side of the distribution of wages, for example. Okay, but there's more to think about, so we can talk about it later. Thanks, Kristen.
Excellent. Thank you, Mario. Really nice presentation. So I'm the residual claimant, and I will try to pull up my slides here next. Can everyone see this okay? Okay, excellent. All right, thank you very much. I'm closing this session, like promised, with a bit of debate time in the end, hopefully. I'm Christian Moser. I'm at Columbia and the Federal Reserve Minneapolis. The usual disclaimer applies for that reason. And this is joint work with my co-author Jacopo Morchiu from Bristol. I'm going to talk about the gender gap, micro sources, and macro consequences. So the introduction for the project is the following. There's a tremendous literature, obviously, on gender in the labor market. A recent strand of this literature has highlighted the role of firms as important agents in such markets. And bringing this together with gender, a couple of recent papers, I should say a very old one actually by Blau, 77, and some more recent work by Cart, Cardoso, and Klein in the QGE in 16 have presented evidence that where men versus women work, at what firms, matters for understanding gender in the labor market. However, I would argue that there's actually quite little known about both the micro sources of these differences and why men and women work in different places. And also, we don't know a whole lot about the macro consequences. So what I want to do in this paper is I want to fill in some of the micro by asking, why do women sort into different firms than men? And on the macro side, I want to ask, how does this matter then for the aggregate gender pay gap, for output and welfare in equilibrium? So here's what we do and find. We're going to use detailed administrative linked employer-employee data from Brazil that allows us to observe men and women jointly across firms where they work. We're going to document a conditional gender pay gap of 8% in this context. But we won't stop here. To understand this 8% gap, we'll develop an empirical equilibrium search model that allows for many different sources of equilibrium allocation and maybe misallocation by gender. And we'll use this model to identify it in the data and then use it for counterfactuals. In doing so, we're going to find the following. Compensating differentials, that is the idea that men versus women differentially prefer certain non-monetary job aspects, explain roughly 1/5 of the gender pay gap. Were we to remove this and all other gender attributes, gender-specific attributes in the labor market, we would obtain welfare and output gains of between 3 and 4%. But although that is arguably an admirable, a desirable goal, it turns out that something as crude as an equal pay mandate, such a policy, is rather ineffective in equilibrium. So let me kind of motivate the study with some empirics. We're going to use, like I said, these admin-linked employer-employee data that some in the room here will know. They're called the Reich. I would argue two advantages of using these data. The first, Brazil is quite interesting as a large economy with historically gaping gender gaps, not unlike in some other Latin American countries, but not all. And interestingly, Brazil's data infrastructure is actually quite advanced and kind of uniquely suited for studying gender, in that it includes information on a set of covariates, specifically age, education, but also the occupation at a 6-digit level, hours worked, parental leaves taken, different pay components, and so on. So against that backdrop, we'll use these data to study the universe of formal sector workers and establishments. Just as a side note, we use the household survey sort of to complement some of this and see what's happening in the informal sector and for people out of the labor force. A lot of interesting results. I won't have time to talk about it realistically today. Standard sample selection, and we'll end up with roughly 230 million worker years, of which 60% are men, 40% are women. And our starting point, running a sort of a very fancy Mincer regression, is a conditional gender pay gap of roughly 8.5 log points. All right, so here are 3 new facts that in our context that I want you to struggle with. The first is that oftentimes job-to-job transitions, which we measure at a monthly rate in our data, result in cuts in the firm-specific component of pay. So what I mean by that is around 30% of men and even 40% of all women, when they transition employers, they receive lower pay at their new firm. Second fact, this firm-specific pay premium, which I'm sort of omitting here how we estimate it, but in a nutshell, it's an AKM type model specific to gender, like in Card et al. This firm size pay premium that equals the elasticity of firm pay with respect to firm size is significant for both genders, but it's around 7% for men and 4% for women. What this means is that if a firm is 100% larger, roughly, it'll pay 7% more for men, but only 4% more to women. And the third fact that I'm throwing out here is that otherwise identical looking men versus women receive different pay within firms. And the experiment that I have in mind here is, as I watch transition two workers, one man and one woman, from firm A to firm B, their relative pay at the old versus new firm diverges quite frequently in the data. They don't move in parallel. And what I would like to convince you of is that these 3 facts are challenging through the lens of a quote-unquote standard labor market model. So let me just very quickly run you through this sort of almost straw man standard labor market model, just to make clear what the tension is. And I want you to really get that part, because I won't have time to run through my full model in a whole lot of detail. But if you understand the tension in the simple framework, you'll easily understand where I'm headed with a much more complicated model. All right, so take us as a starting point, a partial equilibrium version of it at Mortensen 98, it's sort of classical job ladder model of firm size. There's going to be heterogeneous firms that differ in their posted wage W, which has some distribution F. There's homogeneous workers, they're either unemployed or employed, and they search for jobs from both states. That means some arrival rate lambda U from unemployment, lambda E from employment, and some exogenous separation rate delta. Together, these pieces give rise to a so-called job ladder. The idea that workers started at an average firm, but over time work their way up towards better and better employers over time. While employed, workers consume their wage W, while unemployed, they receive just some outside flow value U. Okay, so now picture this economy that has a job ladder of the sort that I described here. This very simple model will face three challenges. Challenge number one is that all job-to-job transitions yield pay gains. The reason for that is that in this model that I just sketched, all utility derives from wages. Since that is in direct conflict with fact one, which said that there were a whole lot of job-to-job transitions with wage cuts, we're going to introduce in our extended model something like gender-specific firm amenities. Challenge number two that this simple model faces is that a firm is large if and only if it pays well. And the reason for that is that wages are the only mechanism to attract workers. To get around this, since this is in conflict with fact two, the fact that women's and men's firm premia differ, and by the way, it's all but monotonic, what we introduce are gender-specific recruiting technologies. The ability for some firms to have a relatively easier time to recruit one gender over another. And challenge number three is simply that two identical workers of different genders would climb the same job ladder, presumably getting equal or maybe proportional pay as they climb up this ladder. The reason for that in the simple model is that there's really just one job ladder, possibly scaled by ability. And in contrast to that, what our data suggested is that men and women have quite different, at least pay, but also probably non-pay experiences as they transition between firms. And to rationalize that, what we'll introduce here will be gender-specific firm surplus or comparative advantage that varies by gender. So in a nutshell, this is sort of, a motivation for three departures from the quote-unquote standard model. I will not have enough time to sketch out the full-blown equilibrium model in a whole lot of detail, but let me just emphasize some key elements. So I want you to think of now a worker not being homogeneous, but differing in their gender and their ability. There's some job offer and destruction rates, like in the previous model, with some slight like bells and whistles added. And while you work, you receive not just your wage, but you also receive your amenity value, here denoted pi, from being in your current job. So a firm is not just a wage, it's a wage plus some unobserved to the econometrician amenity value pi. Now let me turn to firms. In order to rationalize some of these previous facts, we tack on a bunch of things here. A firm for us is not just a productivity or wage level like in the simple stylized model. It is, in addition to that, a gender-specific recruiting technology, CV, a gender-specific amenity creation cost technology, CPI, and then this object that I call an employer wedge, Z, reflecting the gender-specific comparative advantage or gender-specific surplus of a match. The game is the following then. This firm, given its state and given all other firms around it, posts wages W, amenities pi, and vacancies in each of the segmented worker type markets in order to maximize profits. Profits are essentially given by revenue that I'm showing down here. That is a productivity P weighted sum over ability weighted number of workers of each type. But in addition to then paying, receiving revenues and then the usual paying the wage bill, etc., my firms, like workers, will receive some additional disutility that is non-monetary. And in the case of my firms, this non-monetary utility will derive from something like the added benefit or maybe cost of hiring a male versus female employee. Think of this as reflecting maybe comparative advantages in the production process that are unobserved. Or think of it as maybe reflecting something like Becker's taste-based discrimination. All right, so I would argue that this extended model is very attractive in several dimensions, including that it matches our three stylized facts or the challenges that the simple model could not overcome. Just to summarize these, I'm going to read you the headings. Firm-to-firm transitions in this model may result in pay cuts. The main reason being that pay is not everything. Workers also care about the amenity of their job. Property two is that higher ranked firms are not necessarily larger, because although you may be high ranked, you may just have a really hard time recruiting workers of a given gender. So for example, because you don't have the same referral networks or the same university relationships and so on. And property number three is that there are many reasons why otherwise identical workers of different genders may receive different pay, including compensating differentials, labor market attachment, and this employer wedge that I introduced. So the punchline, without going into too many details about all the moving parts in the model, is that it's really quite flexible, and it allows us to speak to these otherwise three puzzling facts. All right, let me move kind of swiftly and essentially skip the identification, although we believe there's a real contribution here. And for the geeks in the audience that would love to understand more about labor market models and linked employer-employee data, I highly recommend that you pick up our paper. Let me just give you some headline results, and I'll skip ahead a little bit. Our main result is that we do a model-based decomposition of the gender pay gap. Our starting point is that the model reproduces a pay gap of roughly 7.5 log points. And now we play the following game. We want to shut down one by one each of these three key model mechanisms that we introduced. The first was that we allowed for job amenities. And after having estimated these, once we shut them down in the recomputed equilibrium, the gender pay gap closes by 1.3 log points, or roughly 20%. Column 2 shows what happens if we shut down the employer wedge that reflects, again, comparative advantage, or maybe employer taste, aka discrimination. The gender gap closes by quite a lot, around 5 log points, or 70% of the total gap. And lastly, if we equalize the recruiting technologies across firms, that was the object that allowed or prevented a firm to recruit a certain amount of workers given their rank, what happens is, yes, we close the gender pay gap, actually by a similar amount, around 70% almost. But in fact, in spite of these wage gains, actually women are worse off in the scenario. The reason being that although women now gravitate towards higher paying jobs, those jobs on average are also less desirable in terms of their non-pay dimension. I personally always think of this as being the Goldman Sachs effect. They pay you a ton of money, but it may not necessarily make you happy in the long run. All right, so let me just conclude here with one last thing, which is that in this world, where I should have mentioned the last column, there are large gains from shutting down all of these gender differences, around 3 to 4%. The policymaker may be tempted to say, well, let's just impose a heavy-handed policy. Let's force all firms to pay the same to equal men and women, equally qualified men and women. And it turns out that this policy, although well-intentioned, in our setting actually backfires. And the reason for that is that if I force the firms that like women the least in relative terms to pay women much more than they would otherwise in the unconstrained equilibrium, in response, these firms will also do two things. One is they'll cut their costly amenities. And the second thing is they will stop hiring women at the margin. So although this policy is well-intentioned, in equilibrium, it gets offset through these other two margins. Let me conclude here. We used a mix of some linked employer-employee data at great detail, together with a revealed preference approach and the empirical equilibrium search model that I presented, to present three main results. The first is that compensating differentials in the form of amenities explain 1/5 of the gender pay gap. We found output and welfare gains of 3 to 4% from moving to a gender-neutral world, but equal pay policies of the type that I described are rather ineffective at achieving these gains. And the general insight, even if you personally may not be as excited about the gender gap as I clearly am, is hopefully that the standard job ladder or labor market models that we work with need to be extended in several dimensions, some of which we have proposed today, in order to understand a lot of heterogeneity in the labor market, including in the context of gender. Thank you very much, and I want to stop here. So, assuming that there's no specific questions right now, or if there are even, why don't we open up the floor? We have around 7 or 8 minutes left before the room closes. And I would welcome any questions about any of the papers that we have heard over the last hour and a half.
Christian, I have a very general question for you actually. So I really like the papers. What I was thinking is, in this model, you've added a lot of new features, in the Bourdette's model. Is there room to add something like experience to it? Because I was thinking that in many countries, women are, suffer this gender pay gap. My hypothesis was that given that they have kids, they need to leave the labor force for longer, and experience is something that is very hard to build and very easy to destroy. So that would be one of my first guesses. But I wonder if that is captured by the amenities, or if there's something new that you would have to add, and if you've thought about it. You're muted, Christian.
Oh, sorry. This is a great question, and actually something we're still processing. Let me give you the following answer. Experience matters, but part of the reason why experience matters in the data actually turns out to be the reason that, over time you find your way into a good employer. That's not all, but that's part of the experience premium. That part is actually the one that we are highlighting with our work. The fact that women might go into different firms, or once they go into maternity leave, they kind of drop out and they lose this sort of capital that they build, the employer capital, or the search capital, something it's called. That's what we highlight, and we don't feature currently in our structural model the other part, that's the on-the-job, tenure returns or human capital accumulation. That's something we currently control for in the data. I can tell you it's also important, but we have nothing intelligent to say over and above, highlighting these statistical differences.
There's also these days this discussion that people who graduated college, they don't have people to teach them because they were at home, and so they're missing out. They're starting to complain. So this speaks to that too, right?
Well, so let me just say very quickly, I teach MBAs. And I think most of the MBA degree value is not that I teach them anything valuable, it's that the MBAs go to happy hours at night and mingle. And that's certainly been lost over the last year and a half. So that's in some sense what we have in mind, with these recruiting technologies, that if I'm Morgan Stanley, I have a really easy time going to Columbia Business School or something like that, and I hire from there. Now it turns out Columbia Business School has 70% men, male students. So it's much easier for Morgan Stanley through this channel to hire men than it is to hire talented women, which might have been overlooked already in the admissions process. So I see no other active cameras or questions coming. I'm reminded by Juan from the conference support team to please keep in mind the lecture by Josh Angrist, which would be really exciting. That's going to start in 15 minutes. So maybe we'll just end 2.5 minutes early. Thanks everyone for joining. And I thought it was a really exciting set of papers. I learned a lot of high-tech papers with some cutting-edge results and interesting topics. So thank you everyone for sharing your work, and hope that next time we can maybe see each other in person.
Let's hope so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.